what he calls it.
Deadpool looks at the camera, breaks the fourth wall, and says something self-aware and sarcastic about being in a superhero movie.
Talked about in the same sentence as Jesus. And it. Passion of the Christ, then me.
And I wonder why that is.
You laugh, you feel seen. Maybe you even got out of your way to check if that cheeky controller was for sale. And somewhere in a boardroom, someone is very pleased with how that went. Here's a question worth sitting with. When did you last actually root for the hero? Not the charming rogue with a tragic backstory. Not the anti-hero who does terrible things, but, you know, understands he does terrible things, so that makes it fine.
I'm so bad, but at least I know I'm bad, so that makes me a little less bad.
The actual hero. The one with a moral compass, a defined sense of right and wrong, and enough restraint to not make every scene about how complicated he is. If you're struggling to remember, that's not an accident, that's a product decision. For decades, cinema gave us protagonists who were essentially walking civic lessons. Selfless, noble, occasionally willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of people they'd never met. And audiences sat in theaters, watching them, respecting them, and somewhere between Act 2 and the climax, quietly checking how much battery they had left on their phone. Not because morality is boring, because lazy writing is boring. These heroes had all the answers. Every moral dilemma, cleanly resolved. Every temptation, heroically resisted. Every villain, ultimately defeated by the power of doing the right thing. They existed to demonstrate virtue, which sounds admirable until you realize it left no room for them to feel like actual people. Meanwhile, the side characters were far more interesting. The morally questionable ones. The ones who operated on logic that made uncomfortable sense. The ones who broke rules not out of arrogance, but out of a very reasonable read of how the world actually works. People left theaters talking about those characters. Directors started noticing the pattern, and then they started building franchises around it. This shift didn't emerge purely from artistic courage. While the concept of the anti-hero existed before cinema, it became more prominent after a cultural decline in institutional trust. After Vietnam, after Watergate, after Americans watched their government systematically lie to them in real time, on television, with full documentation, something broke. Not just politically, narratively. The idea that authority figures were trustworthy, that systems were essentially just, that clean moral lines mapped onto real events, all of that started to feel like propaganda. Because a lot of it was. So audiences stopped wanting to watch idealized authority on screen. They wanted characters who reflected how power actually behaves. Someone who bends rules because the rules were already bent before they got there. Someone whose choices feel inevitable given their circumstances. Not because a screenwriter needed a moral delivered by Act 3, but because the logic of their world demands it. That appetite produced some genuinely extraordinary storytelling. Tony Soprano managing his anxiety alongside his criminal empire. Walter White dismantling the myth of the respectable middle-class man, one decision at a time. Jack Sparrow treating every institution he encounters as a joke, because every institution he encounters is a joke. These characters worked because they were psychologically honest. They weren't designed to be aspirational. They were designed to be recognizable. And recognition, it turns out, creates a much more durable attachment than admiration. Studios notice that too. Here's the thing about moral ambiguity that has nothing to do with artistic integrity. A character with clear moral positions is a liability. Give a protagonist a defined stance on justice, or violence, or institutional power, and you've built an expiration date into the character. Cultural climates shift. What reads as righteous in one decade, reads as problematic in the next. A clearly moral character can be measured against their morality, and eventually they'll fall short of it. That's when the think pieces start. That's when the backlash arrives. Anti-heroes have structural immunity to this problem. A character who never claimed a moral standard cannot be held to one. A character who is visibly, loudly inconsistent, who mocks their own contradictions before anyone else can name them, is extraordinarily difficult to criticize. You can't cancel someone whose whole identity is that they're already aware of everything wrong with them.
Like Virus, I hope you have given this deeply nuanced and richly layered backstory its due.
Yeah, we're covering the time travel stuff.
This isn't a creative philosophy, it's a risk management strategy. And a character that can't be canceled is not just a story. It's a long-term commercial asset, licensing rights, streaming deals, merchandise, brand collaborations across decades, the character identity becomes more valuable than anything that actually happens in the films. Studios stopped asking, is this good? And started asking, is this durable? Those are very different questions, and they produce very different films. Deadpool is where this becomes impossible to ignore. The 2016 film was genuinely a breath of fresh air. An R-rated superhero who broke the fourth wall, mocked the genre from inside the genre, and delivered what felt like an honest rebuke of everything bloated and self-serious about comic book cinema. It was funny, it was sharp, it felt like it was on the audience's side. What was harder to see in the moment was the architecture underneath. Deadpool never claims moral seriousness, specifically so it can never be judged for lacking it. Watch what the film actually does. It criticizes movies that reduce female characters to motivation material for the male lead.
Well, that sounds misogynistic.
Yeah, it reduces the woman to a plot device.
Then it gives Vanessa, the female lead, no arc, no agency, and no presence beyond appearing occasionally to remind Wade Wilson why he's doing things. The film names the problem, then does the problem, then moves on before you've processed either. It mocks forced inclusion, then includes scenes that do exactly that.
Gender neutral. From now on, we'll be known as X-Force.
It positions itself as a critique of corporate superhero filmmaking, while being structurally a corporate superhero.
We need to build a team. We need them tough, morally flexible, and young enough to carry this franchise 10 to 12 years.
Film built to generate sequels, and I'm pretty sure there's one more sequel coming up. There's even a line in the PG-13 cut, Once Upon a Deadpool, where Deadpool directly says that in an industry dominated by the exploitation of existing brands, an immediate sequel was demanded.
Surprisingly popular movie, which, in an industry dominated by the exploitation of existing brands, demanded an immediate sequel.
He is describing his own exploitation. The line is played for laughs. The sequel made hundreds of millions of dollars. This is the move. Point at the hypocrisy first, frame it as self-awareness, and the audience laughs and moves on. The criticism gets absorbed into the brand identity rather than threatening it. By mocking advertising culture throughout the film,
Velcro. Color-coded, efficient, environmentally friendly.
fake ad placements, jokes at marketing language,
Huggies Natural Care Wet Wipes. That's your main course. They're soft, they're moist. They're for babies.
constant product mockery, Deadpool disarms the audience's skepticism about being marketed to. Then the actual marketing begins.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm normally all in on the legal and moral opaqueness of subliminal advertising, but not when it messes with my trailer.
The Microsoft Cheeky Controller campaign generated 5 billion impressions and a 25% sales boost. Controller was never for sale. That result came entirely from the strength of the character identity. That is what studios are actually building when they build anti-heroes, not stories. Infrastructure. When cancel culture became a genuine force in the early 2020s, studios faced a real problem. Decades of shallow representation, surface-level engagement with serious topics, and characters built around aesthetics rather than substance. All of it was suddenly being held to account. The industry had two options: invest in actual writing, develop characters with real interiority, real stakes, real ideological commitments, and do the difficult work of representing the world with honesty. Or engineer characters who are structurally immune to the criticism before it arrives. The anti-hero was the second option. An anti-hero justifies morally gray behavior through backstory, so the behavior doesn't require examination. They're sarcastic about serious things, so engaging seriously with them makes you the awkward one in the conversation. They acknowledge their own flaws loudly and constantly, so external critique has nowhere to land that hasn't already been occupied. They're funny enough that calling them out reads as humorlessness. It is an extraordinarily well-engineered defense system disguised as a character. 3 years after Deadpool, The Boys arrived. By then, audiences were already conditioned, already comfortable with violent protagonists operating in moral gray zones, already familiar with superhero satire, already primed to read cynicism as intelligence. The writing could go darker, more provocative, more willing to go places traditional storytelling wouldn't touch. Not because the cultural conversation had matured, because the groundwork had been laid for audiences to accept this register as the default. This is a pipeline, not a coincidence. Not an organic, artistic evolution, a deliberate commercial infrastructure built around characters who are lucrative precisely because they can't be pinned down. Here's what nobody building these franchises will say in an interview. Writing a genuinely good hero is much harder than writing an anti-hero. An anti-hero's relatability is built on recognition, on reflecting back the moral complexity audiences already feel in themselves. That's not nothing, but it's also not particularly difficult. Most people already contain contradictions. Most people already justify their decisions through context and circumstance. Showing that on screen doesn't require much imagination. It just requires honesty about how humans already work. A real hero requires something different. A hero has to model something the audience doesn't already have, has to make choices that are harder than what the circumstance demands, has to arrive at a worldview not through surrender to circumstances but through deliberate, costly decision-making. That is a much harder thing to write and a much rarer thing to find in contemporary cinema. Aragorn runs from his inheritance for most of 3 films. The crown is available to him, and he refuses it. His heroism is built on restraint rather than action, on the willingness to not take power when the power is his to take. That's a genuinely radical character stance, and it makes his eventual rise feel like it was earned across years. And then there's Thorfinn in Vinland Saga, who is one of the most complete character arcs in recent storytelling. He starts as a revenge-obsessed killer, defined entirely by his hatred, his trauma, and his need to destroy the person who dismantled his childhood. And across years of brutal, patient, uncompromising storytelling, he arrives at a place where he can say, with complete sincerity, "I have no enemies. I will save everyone I can." That is not a redemption arc in the Hollywood sense, where the character does one noble thing in the 3rd act and we're invited to forgive them. That is a total reconstruction of identity, built on actual loss and actual consequence. It takes the length of time real change takes. These characters don't get billion-dollar marketing campaigns. They don't justify consumption. They don't tell you what to buy or wear or value. They don't relate to corporate infrastructure in any way that's commercially useful. A hero who doesn't need the system to define them is genuinely useless to the system. An anti-hero who loudly mocks the system while functioning perfectly within it, that's the product. That's what gets the sequel greenlit. The anti-hero wasn't a mistake. The original impulse was to push back against propaganda-adjacent heroism, to create characters who reflected genuine moral complexity rather than civic instruction. That was legitimate. There's real storytelling in that space, and some of it has been extraordinary. The problem is what the industry did with the instinct once it identified the commercial potential. Characters constructed to be immune to criticism. Narratives designed around moral ambiguity as a defensive posture rather than an honest one. Stories that absorb the language of self-awareness without doing any of the actual work self-awareness requires. Studios investing in character identities specifically because character identities are durable assets that survive cultural shifts, generate licensing revenue across decades, and can never be held to a standard they never claimed to have. The reason we're tired of traditional heroes isn't because heroism is unrealistic. It's because lazy writing made it feel that way, and the industry decided the solution was to stop trying rather than to try harder. So the next time a morally flexible, sardonic, tragically backstoried protagonist looks directly at the camera and winks at you, consider whether you're watching genuine subversion, or whether you're watching a company that identified your appetite for subversion, packaged it carefully, and is now selling it back to you at a significant markup. There's a difference. It's just designed to be difficult to see.